way to the end. We have slipped a little behind schedule, and we are definitely wanting to hear everything that Jim has to say.
You know, if I'm going to do this, I need you to stand up and shake.
Yeah, really.
While we get this up.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, actually. So, okay. You put a PowerPoint in here?
Yeah.
Okay. There it is.
Right
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we'll just fire it up right to it. Now sit down. Our speaker's about to sit. Sit down. So the only deal about the schedule, we actually have to be out of the building by 6. And we have wine. We've been working all day for this goal. So we will give Jim this time to maybe not have quite as much formal discussion afterwards. Or continue the informal discussion. Okay? Take it away, Jim.
I've been working on deleting paragraphs, so if they're lacuna, you'll be happy. I would change the title of this to Speculations on the Obvious by the Uninformed. It's fun to play at archaeologists, but I'm not one. As an artist, I make and mark things. Recently, I marked the exterior of this museum, which is probably why I'm here today, my punishment. I can't really believe that I have anything to say that those of you in the field haven't already thought of, so these remarks might be simply a checklist for your own thoughts. I have 4 groups of observations. If I get through them all, we'll pause to, well, I don't think we'll pause for discussion in between, but this is where we're going. I'm interested in materiality, and many of the speakers have already spoken to that. Stone outcropped, dressed stone, plaster walls, each has a specific set of material constraints. So the kind of physical effort required to manipulate each material will differ vastly. The constraints of stone are encountered by the builders of stone structures, those marking them, and those unearthing them. Let's not forget them. Different intentions and processes up against the same constraints, therefore experienced differently. So it's not just the stuff, but what you want to do with the stuff that matters. But the stuff still matters. On hard rock, well, I'm going to skip some stuff here. On hard rock, lines moving in a single direction would be easier than curved lines due to the momentum of physical force, even in softer stone. A curved mark requires controlling a continuous change in direction. Even in something as simple as graphite marks on paper, it requires training and practice to make lines that counter the direction of movement most natural to the bones and muscles of the dominant hand. So, rotating your arm in space, radius is the name of one of the bones in your forearm for a reason. Doing this is very different than doing this. Cutting grooves or channels into stone might require more than one act of gouging. I need time. How much time? How many repeated motions? I will scrape my knuckles. If others before me have left marks adjacent to or perhaps underneath my marks, what's to keep me from following existing grooves, only making them deeper? How would someone else ever know? With repeated action, there's rhythm. Repetition is compelling. It is codified in human culture, in visual pattern and ornament, in song, dance, and music, in speech, in chants and prayers. Ritual is a form of repetition. Repetition serves memory. Manifold human actions involve repetition because doing something takes time and repeated effort. And because we are conscious of time, repetition itself accumulates its own meanings. Scratching or carving stone creates uniquely identifiable sounds in rhythmic sequence. People carving graffiti in an enclosed space. What would it sound like? Anything like the soundscape of an archaeological dig, such as we have upstairs? The stone gongs are a marvelous example of carvers listening to the work that they are doing. By our standards of legibility and refinement, there appear to be different levels of skill in the markings of El Kuru. What is skill? Understanding how to marshal the most useful tools, understanding the economy of effort, knowing how to position my body in relation to the surface, deploying body mass to maximize effort. You could say the sandstone is very easy to carve, but these are all factors even if I'm doing a drawing on paper. These would be carved by people for whom physical effort was a part of daily life. So what else is necessary? Perhaps difference in experience, and therefore knowing what is achievable under particular conditions. It helps to have seen how it's done. Even the smallest effort to make an image requires some time and resources. This effort competes with daily life and subsistence. Who is willing to expend that effort depends on that person's definition of time and effort well spent, which of course depends on a complex set of cultural standards for how one organizes a meaningful life. Image, object, or action. Tools and materials constrain the form of the image. A woven or painted boat will not be the same as a scratched or carved boat. These different forms might be signs for the same object or class of objects, floating structures that we use to cross the water. But in and of themselves, the images are very different things. So it makes a difference whether the image is significant primarily as a sign, pointing symbolically or metaphorically to something else, like the word boat does, or if its power lies in its presence as a thing in and of itself, or if it is the act of making the image that matters. The thing named, the thing that names, or the act of naming. The extension of the material surface is significant in forming an image. How large is it? How are my marks scaled to it? Is it a flat wall or the drum of a column? How easily can I reach it? What's bounding the surface I've appropriated for my marks, and what is its shape, the direction of the edges, the distance between my marks and those edges, what else is going on within the boundaries, exerting any influence on my decision on what to put there and how to put it. If I have to cross a boundary like the seam between stones or a previously carved line, how do I accommodate that line in my image? Our ability to make images, let alone find them meaningful, is constrained by images that we have been exposed to. Saul Bellow famously said that a writer is a reader moved to emulation. We're inspired to draw by what we've seen drawn. The translation from the three-dimensional moving world to a fixed, flat image is a monumental leap, requiring complex cognitive processing. Making visual images might be a universal human impulse, but we need models for the images we create. It seems safe to assume that a graffiti carving of a lion is based maybe less on a real lion than on a previously encountered carving of a lion. Where would I have encountered those images? Lines. Many of the graffiti at El Kuru are examples of line drawings, a highly abstract process. Here's some aspects of line drawings to consider. Bounding, isolating, naming. An exterior contour isolates a form by bounding it, extracting it from the ground of which it is a part. The power to isolate something from its context determines how we see it and what we can do with it once we see it. It's not unlike what happens when I name something, extracting it with language from the temporal spatial flux. The exterior contour of a silhouette is an act of naming, flat, schematic, but adequate. If the goal is simply to establish the identity of a form, and the exterior contour is unique enough, then nothing else matters. Nothing else is necessary. Figure ground. In a line drawing, the surface inside the line and the surface outside the line are the same. Not the case in the engravings that Fauzi was showing us. Establishing figure and ground depends on what happens at the edge. The closed boundaries of a linear form encourage us to see what lies inside these lines as figure and everything around it as ground. Like the act of naming, closed boundaries make the form salient. Interior detail helps us identify a form and declares, this is figure, look here. The most important features of a rectangle are its corners. Diagonal lines from corner to corner locate the center of the rectangle at their crossing. The center is the most powerful place in a rectangle because it unites all the dominant features in one point. The rectangle is a bounded field of vision. The center of a field of vision is where the viewer is located. I am here. The absolute miracle of wherever I go, there I am. The logic of the whole. So based on ruins and site plans, you judge what was original at what stage and what was later added or improvised. You're acutely aware of layers. The carving on the pylons of the Epidemic temple at Naga is integrated so fully into its architectural context that I cannot see it as an afterthought. It's impossible. Yet the wall was probably constructed before it was carved. The carved standing figures symmetrically flank the front entrance with careful attention to contour lines leading from the upper outside corner through their shoulders toward the entry door. The figures face inward toward the door. Their upraised arms to the outside are on the near side of their bodies, the inside arms flowing toward the entrance or behind. So the figures seem to lead us across the surface toward the entry and actually into it. So there's a considered relationship throughout the carving, between the carving and the building. The line of figures across the bottom seems to map, if not exactly mirror, our own scale, standing on the ground before the temple. The ground on which we stand stretches away on all sides. The ground has been incorporated into the logic of the whole and the narrative of what brought us here. The carved contours compete with the joints in the stonework for visibility and their own semantic integrity. To make such a carving effective, the lines must be located so that they're not confused by their intersections with the structural supports. So the parts submit to the logic of the whole. The content of the carving is as much located in the relationship among its parts as to the individual forms in isolation. The carving maps and measures the facade it's carved on. In the carvings that are characterized as graffiti, if boat alternated with ram down the columns in a regular sequence, and I think Jeremy's example comes close to this, or if the east side carvings were symmetrical to the west, we would think quite differently about how these images came to be where they are and why, no matter how crude or modestly scaled. So I contend that surface ornament is an act of mapping and measurement. The Epidemic carving maps and measures the shape and function of that facade, and its time travel is locked in with the facade. The graffiti are focused within a smaller field of vision and more indirectly aligned with one another. Nevertheless, they transform the walls they are on, mapping them into a palimpsest of accumulated individual encounters over time. That temporal element is part of what makes them so fascinating, of course, inseparable from the intimacy of their within arm's reach human scale. Location and authority, sanctioned or unsanctioned, planned or improvised, isolated or coordinated activities. The same image painted or scratched on the wall of my dining room, painted in the alley behind the Michigan Theater, or placed, heaven forbid, on the windows of this museum would mean something completely different. Graffiti in the public spaces of contemporary urban centers is an act of naming, claiming, establishing presence. Presence is power, even a form of ownership. Inevitably, then, our understanding of property becomes significant. In our own time, the criminalization of graffiti is part of its meaning. Obviously not in the time under discussion now. In our own time, it contests public spaces by putting that space to individual use, or to the uses of a subculture of other graffiti writers. In our culture, graffiti lays claim to a space for purposes not shared by whatever authority is in control of it. But what happens if everybody is a potential graffiti writer, including the authority? The word public implies accessibility. If this is not public space, but I have access to it, whose space is it? What is the relationship of authority to the carvers of these marks? This is what a lot of the discussion really has been about today. Public space, as I know it, invites conflict because not all of us have identical needs or even access to the space. Therefore, public space must be regulated by cultural convention or by authoritarian control. Is the El Kuru graffiti an example of unregulated marks? Were they made by or on behalf of those who had authority over that space? Or was the authority to enforce regulation absent? We all have our own theories about that. Legibility. If these markings are part of a social conversation, audience matters. Who's the audience? If these markings are part of an act of devotion, the primary audience might not be human, might not share the limits of our human perceptions and understandings. The question of legibility places emphasis on the made thing, the marks themselves. If the made thing is what matters, could I commission someone to carve an image for me on my behalf? In that case, in what sense is it mine? Or is it the act of carving itself that's significant? If drilled holes tap into the power of the structure, do carved lines do the same? Aside from legibility, how else does it matter how deeply the lines are carved? Landscape movement narrative. Humans move through space. Pilgrimage is movement. By following a path, I join my movement to the movement of others. The act of movement may be as important as the point of arrival. I know a landscape by moving through it. Built structures have been consciously placed within it, according to the features of the land. According to the naturalist Barry Lopez, the land is an animal that contains all other animals, vigorous and alive. Land, he says, is the source of language, which evolves in human conversation with the land. I say that would be even truer of images, especially images carved into the material gathered from the surrounding land. So my movements have brought me to this place. It's become a place because others have marked it as significant. My own significance is expanded by my being here and by my association with it. By standing here and talking, I'm leaving a very transient mark to designate my presence, but also appropriating the power of this site for myself, tapping into it for my own purposes. Graffiti is an act of naming and an act of storytelling. I was here at a moment in time, something happened to bring me here, Something happened to take me away, but I have left a carving to mark an isolated sequence of moments in the flux that flows away on both sides of this carving through the surrounding landscape. Movement is narrative. Narrative helps us to understand temporality. The presence of many individual narratives mark the site of both individual and group experience within the landscape. Both site and landscape are being constructed by these narratives. As graffiti map the surface of the structure, they also map its temporal-spatial narrative. Walking, running, raking, rowing, digging, painting, dancing, carving. What is your mind doing while you're occupied in repeated actions over time? Listening to music or a story in your earbuds? Counting out your steps? What's your inner soundscape as the wheels of your mind spin? Graffiti marks the movement of a surface through time. Groups of marks accumulate as an individual adds them to the surface. Later groups of marks are positioned in conversation with earlier marks. This archaeological project invites me to bring the layers of my own life into that conversation in a process of mutual and collective self-creation over time.
You may find it a little harder to respond in the moment because these thoughts are resonant and it's the end of a long day. Does anyone have any questions, comments about the parts you liked best? I mean, I was typing furiously. I don't know if you noticed, but I was taking a lot of notes. And one of the things I really like is, as archaeologists, we're looking at the products of this as the salient fact, but you're encouraging us to think about it's the act of making that experientially for the people who are doing it. That's what we need to be focusing on. It's I think it's a very useful contribution.
And you're carrying forward what's been done.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. Part of the great chain of graffiti. The audience.
Maybe the audience was not, the intended audience is not necessarily the most important audience, is not necessarily other people.
The most important audience is not necessarily people. Yes. New inspiration from the reappearance of the graffiti. Yeah. I mean, this whole idea about the flow, it's not just a static object. That's another aspect of it. Yeah. Other thoughts, comments? Would you like to join me in thanking our speakers and our audience? Thank you all. Let's go next door and eat some snacks. Okay? Thank you all.